The Iceberg Hermit, Chapter 7. It was now the time of the long Arctic night, from mid-November to the end of January, when the sun was completely absent from the sky. On clear days, however, Alan could still tell where the sun was hiding, as the sky above the horizon at that point was a lighter shade of blue than the rest of the heavens. On clear days and nights, he often left the Forbes to watch the exciting display of Aurora Borealis, those waving bands and shimmering curtains of coloured light that arced across the sky in ever-changing patterns. There were still and windless nights when the frozen sea seemed to glow from inside, now a pink colour, and now a light blue as the ice reflected the moonlight or starshine or the dancing show of northern lights. At such times, Alan was almost thankful he was on the Forbes. Otherwise, he would never have known the beauty of those northern nights. A beauty that sometimes took his breath away and made him want to weep. But there were other times, especially when Nancy was in one of her deep sleeps and the wind howled for days without let-up, that he really did weep, from despair. And although he had plenty of food, a sort of weakness came over him, and he did not want to leave his closet. He did not want to go outside. He had no appetite, and no desire to do anything except stay beneath the bedclothes. He wished that he could sleep for a week at a time, like Nancy, and sometimes he even imagined, after 24 hours inside the closet, that he had learned how to hibernate. But that was silly, of course, because he knew that he was awake most of the time. Sometimes it was Nancy waking up that pulled him out of one of his bad moods, or sometimes it was a clear windless day or night that drew him outside to marvel at the beauty of the ice, or the vast millions of stars in the mysterious black vault of the velvet skies. Sometimes, for no reason at all, he would come out of his black mood and start to dream up all kinds of plans to make life more comfortable and more interesting on the Forbes. Alan spent a lot of his time in training Nancy. He taught her such words as stay, sit, stand, and so on. She began to gain weight very quickly, and soon she was the size of a small calf. She often followed Alan out of the wreck and around on the ice. Sometimes she tried to dig down through the ice as though she were trying to get into the sea, but the ice was far too thick for her. She loved to roll around in the drifts of snow behind ice floes, and could not understand why Alan would not wrestle with her in the snow. At the bottom of the ice mountain there was a clear slope of ice about 50 feet long, and Nancy loved to climb to the top of the slope, sit down and slide to the bottom on her back, her 4 paws up in the air. She looked so comical on her slide that Alan never tired of watching her. He found Nancy very gentle, and never once did she show any signs of turning on him, of trying to claw or bite him. Like a dog, she would sometimes take Alan's hand in her mouth, but so gently that her sharp teeth never broke the skin. She often tried to imitate Alan and learned to walk erect for short distances. On some moonlight days, Alan would take Nancy outside and tell her to stand. Then he would link arms with her and give the command, walk. He and Nancy would then go for a short stroll over the ice, looking for all the world like a stuffy old married couple taking a Sunday walk in his native Aberdeen. Nancy looked so funny, waddling along arm in arm with Alan, that he often broke into fits of laughing, and Nancy would even try to imitate his laugh. She would squeeze up her face and nose, half close her eyes, and give a whinny that sounded exactly like a horse. At such times, watching Nancy try so hard to imitate her master, Alan felt a pure love for his pet. One thing he was positive of: no matter how short he ran on food, he would never kill Nancy to save himself. It would be like killing a brother or a sister. And so the winter wore away, and the light patch in the southern sky grew brighter and brighter. Alan now found it very hard to make up his mind what to do. He wanted to strike out for land while the sea ice was still frozen, but he had no idea in which direction to find the shore, and he did not know how far he might have to travel. And even should he find land, how would he live when he got there? Alan knew of Eskimos, of course, They sometimes traded animal skins and furs to the captains of whaling ships, but on her last trip the Anne Forbes had been at sea the whole time, so that Alan had never actually seen an Eskimo. And Eskimos were few and far between in the polar regions. He could wander along until long after his food was all gone before he met any of those strange inhabitants of the Arctic. And even should he fall in with a band of Eskimos, it might be years before the Eskimos came into contact with any Europeans. But if he stayed on the iceberg and kept a sharp lookout, he should be able to spot a sailing vessel either on its way to or back from the whaling grounds. There were at least 24 whaling ships that made the round trip every year from Scotland and England, and twice as many Dutch whalers, not to mention the occasional French, German or American ship that came up to try its luck. If he climbed to the peak of his ice mountain and planted a signal flag there, surely it would be noticed by one of the whaling ships. And if he himself spotted a ship far out to sea, he could light a fire and burn 2 or 3 pounds of oakum, which threw off a dense black smoke that would be visible for miles. He had found over 100 pounds of oakum in one of the holds, so he had plenty of material to make smoke signals with. But staying on the iceberg had its dangers too. The Anne Forbes, loosened from the grip of the winter ice, would probably sink. And how could he survive with the Anne Forbes gone? Then, too, the iceberg might get caught in a south-flowing current, drift down to warmer waters and melt. It was a hard decision to make, either to leave the comfort and security of the Anne Forbes and strike out on his own over the unknown ice, or to take his chances on the iceberg. One day, on his trip over to the ice mountain to replenish his water supplies, he got an idea that helped to make up his mind. When it looked as though the sea ice were breaking up, he would shift his living quarters to the peak of the iceberg. For the next 3 days the weather was stormy, the wind blowing so hard that the loose snow made it impossible to see more than a step or two ahead on the ice. For 3 days Alan stuck to the cabin on the Anne Forbes. Anxious to get going on his plan, he started out for the ice mountain as soon as the weather cleared. He and Nancy left the ship, and Alan noticed as he hiked over the ice that the light patch in the southern sky had turned to orange. The colour gradually built to a fiery red that lit up the whole sky and faded away in the north to a dying pale pink. He had just about reached the Iceberg Mountain when the sun put in an appearance, a glowing scarlet tip of a fingernail that rested on the horizon. Ah, Nancy lass, there it is again, the lovely sun. He threw his arms around Nancy and hugged her. Nancy took the hug as an invitation to wrestle and promptly dumped her master on his backside. For a moment they rolled over and over on the ice, Alan letting out whoops of joy. He got to his feet and managed to calm down his pet. Then he spent the next hour or so just watching the sun. The sunrise soon turned into a sunset as the topmost rim of the sun dipped again beneath the horizon. In the space of less than an hour, Alan had seen both a sunrise and a sunset. And while he hated to see the sun go away, he knew that on each succeeding day the glowing orange ball would climb higher and higher into the sky, filling the whole northern world with its promise of light and warmth. Now then, lass, you've seen your first sunrise, Alan said to his pet. Nancy whinnied. Alan looked up at the ice mountain. His whole body seemed to be flooded with new energy. We'll carve out steps to the top of yon peak, he said, his staff pointing upward. We'll make a house up there, so we will. A wee cave house for the summer, and, Nancy, love, we'll sit up there in cool and splendid ease, and we'll eat the best of food, and drink an odd snort of rum to keep out the damp, and we'll have a lovely high seat to watch for the whaling fleet. Oh, aye. But we'll have a glorious time, the two of us. Nancy took his hand in her mouth and tugged. You're anxious to start, is that it? It took Alan a couple of weeks of hard work to chip out steps to the top of the ice mountain. His flight of steps wound in and out of deep cracks in the face of the berg. 20 or so feet beneath the peak, where the ice was still thick, he began to hollow out a cave. He now had plenty of tools from the Anne Forbes to work with, and on days when the weather was not too cold and there was enough light, he hacked away at his cave hollow. A couple of months later, his ice cave actually had 2 rooms, a tiny back sleeping room and a larger front room that served as a kitchen and lookout point. As the days grew longer, Alan kept bringing more and more supplies to the ice mountain. He brought carpeting and extra bedclothes, coal and a whale blubber for a fire, one of his lamps and a supply of oil, a box of ship biscuits and several bottles full of rum. He brought some frozen meat and a long lance pole from one of the holds. Almost on the very tip of the iceberg, he drilled a small hole in the ice and put up his lance pole. On top of the pole, he tied one of the captain's red shirts as a signal to any ships that might be passing by. But he found that the wind soon tore the shirt to shreds, so he left the pole bare, meaning to attach a flag of sorts once the sea was clear of ice, and therefore safe for navigation. And now, with the coming of spring and the increasing chance of rescue, Alan's thoughts turned more and more to that other Nancy, his Nancy of the red gold hair and large blue eyes. He first met her the day he walked past the front door of McLean's drapery shop and saw her standing just inside the entrance. She was sweeping the floor, and he noticed the splotches of damp here and there on the floorboards, where used tea leaves from the morning's breakfast had been scattered to keep down the dust. At the time, he had just turned 14 and was finishing his 2nd year in Craggy's tailoring establishment. He had heard that McLean's was getting a new shop girl, but he had thought that the new girl would be much older. At that first sight of Nancy, he fell head over heels in love. From one of the other shop assistants he found out her name, Nancy Campion. From then on, every excuse he got, he went parading past the drapery shop windows. One day he talked Mr. Craggy into allowing him to take his horse to the blacksmith for new shoes. On that glorious day, seated casually on the bare back of the powerful horse, he managed to parade past McLean's and be twice seen by Nancy, once on his way going and once coming back. And on the return voyage, noting her standing just inside the doorway of the shop, he had swept off his cloth cap and called down from the back of the horse, "Brave day, Miss Campion." She had smiled, blushed, then run back into the shop. Unfortunately, because he worked indoors at Craggy's, he did not have too many chances of seeing her. Of course, he always volunteered to run up to McLean's when Mr. Craggy ran out of buttons or thread or linen, stiffening or chalk, but Mr. Craggy always liked to do his own buying in the drapery store. However, there was one time of the day he could count on seeing her, at 8 o'clock in the morning, when he swept the wooden sidewalk in front of Craggy's. 100 yards up the street, Nancy would be doing the same job outside her shop. And after they had both swept their stretches of sidewalk, Nancy sweeping down and he sweeping up, they would, often more than not, lean on their brooms for a little while and look at each other. And those were the most precious moments of the day for Alan. If he heard a cart coming down the street, he would hold his breath until it passed McLean's. Then he had to pray that the man did not want to stop at the tailor's, and how he groaned when the cart stopped in front of Craggy's, for he knew he would have to go inside and see what the man wanted. But if the cart rattled on past, then how precious those extra few moments were, leaning on his broom and looking up at his Nancy, and how, for the rest of the day, he would treasure that little wave she gave him when she finally had to go back inside the shop. Ah, Nancy, Nancy, but those were innocent days for both of us, he cried out. And Nancy, his pet, came waddling over to where he stood at the foot of the ice mountain. She thrust her moist black nose into his hand. Alan looked out over the frozen wastes of ice. It was a long way from the bustling streets of Aberdeen. A sudden gust of wind brought tears to his eyes. He turned away, hunched his shoulders, and struggled back to the empty hulk of the Anne Forbes. That's the end of chapter 7. Good night.